Have you ever watched a single dewdrop resting on a blade of grass in the early morning? Tiny, delicate, almost invisible to the rushing mind. And yet, if you pause long enough, just long enough, you'll notice something extraordinary. Within that one drop of water, the sky is mirrored. The clouds pass through it. The rising sun dances in its surface like a flame behind a veil. The entire world reflects in its fragile curve. What if this wasn't just a trick of light? What if the dewdrop is not just a part of the world, but a doorway into it? In Buddhism, this simple image isn't poetic fluff. It's a profound pointer, a sacred metaphor. It whispers a truth that sages have spoken for millennia. The infinite can be seen in the infinitesimal. The whole is present in the part. The ocean lives in the dewdrop. This is not just about water. This is about you. And this is about everything. The mind often wants to separate things. Big and small, self and other, sacred and ordinary. But reality, true, unfiltered reality, doesn't split that way. A flower blooming in a crack on the sidewalk carries the same mystery as a galaxy swirling in space. The warmth in a stranger's smile holds the same wonder as the birth of a star. You don't need to fly to the Himalayas or escape into a cave to touch truth. It's right here. It's always been here. In a single moment, in a single breath, in a single drop. Ancient Buddhist masters called this the interbeing of all phenomena. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, a jewel of Mahayana thought, it is said that one atom of dust contains the entire universe. Not metaphorically, not abstractly, literally. Why? Because nothing exists independently. A dewdrop isn't just water. It's rain clouds, air pressure, sun, and wind. It's the cycle of evaporation, the cooling night, the soft curve of a leaf. It's time itself, past, present, future, curled into a liquid pearl. If you truly see the dewdrop, you don't just see a small thing. You see a miracle of causes and conditions, a symphony of the cosmos played in one note. The boundaries collapse. The "this is just a drop" illusion dissolves, and you begin to sense it, that which is small is never separate. Now pause, really breathe, don't just listen, feel. Think of your life with all its pressure and weight. The expectations, the deadlines, the disappointments, the longing to find something more, some meaning grand enough to quiet the storm inside. But what if the more you seek has always been hidden in the less? What if the most sacred teachings aren't locked in ancient texts, but whispering through the ordinary? What if you've already seen the ocean, countless times, but never recognized it because it wore the mask of a drop? The Buddha didn't point us away from life. He pointed us into it, into each sensation, each step, each blink, each falling leaf. Because in that moment, this moment, everything is here. There's a Zen story that speaks to this. A young monk asks his teacher, "What is the ultimate truth?" The old master looks at him and replies, "The cypress tree in the courtyard." No explanation, no philosophy, just the tree. It wasn't about the tree, it was about seeing. The kind of seeing that doesn't split the sacred and the mundane. The kind of seeing that cuts through the noise and touches the heart of being. Because when you truly see one thing, you're no longer looking at it, you're looking into it. And in that depth, the borders dissolve. You see not a tree, but the universe treed. Not a dewdrop, but the ocean distilled. So why does this matter? Because we spend so much of our lives chasing something bigger, some future breakthrough, some grand revelation. But the wisdom of the dewdrop calls us back to the present, back to what the Zen masters call suchness, the direct, raw presence of things as they are. It's not about reducing life to something smaller. It's about seeing more in what's already here. It's about letting the moment bloom until you realize it was never just a moment at all. It was eternity in disguise. And when this shift happens, even briefly, you begin to walk differently. You taste your tea with more reverence. You listen to the wind as if it carries secrets. You look into the eyes of others and see not a stranger but a reflection. Because now you understand, what is inside one is inside all. You don't have to become a monk. You don't need robes, incense, or Sanskrit. You only need to slow down, to pay attention, to let go of the need to dissect everything and instead allow yourself to marvel. Marvel at how the infinite can shimmer inside the fragile. Marvel at how your life, exactly as it is, may already be enough, may already be holy, even in your struggles, even in your silence, even in the smallest, softest, most fleeting drop of dew. The ocean waits. When we begin to see the world this way, a question arises, not from the mind but from something deeper. If nothing exists alone, if every dewdrop reflects the ocean, then what does that say about us? About how we live, how we relate, how we suffer, how we love? Let's step further in. Not with answers, but with open eyes. Because what comes next isn't a theory, it's a mirror, and it shows us how the whole world moves in harmony. When nothing stands alone, look around you, the room you're in, the phone or screen you're holding, the air you're breathing. Everything is the result of something else. Nothing is truly alone. The cup of tea in your hand carries the clouds. The food on your table holds the labor of countless hands. Even your breath is not yours alone. It is shared with trees, with wind, with generations who came before you. In Buddhism, this is not just poetic reflection. It is the law of reality, pradityasamutpada, dependent origination, 12 syllables and the entire universe inside them. It means this is because that is. This arises because that arose. Nothing stands on its own. Nothing. Let's make it simple. You're holding a single sheet of paper. It seems like just a piece of paper, right? But look deeper. There is a cloud in this paper. Without rain, no tree. Without tree, no pulp. Without pulp, no page. There is the logger, the saw, the factory, the sunlight, the earth. And there's more people who built the machines, the mother who raised the logger, the coffee that gave him energy, the soil that grew the beans, the stars that died to make that soil. If you keep looking, you'll realize the whole universe had to come together just so this page could exist. Can you still call it just a piece of paper? The Vietnamese Zen master Thich, NH letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH calls this interbeing. Not just interconnected, but interbeing, meaning nothing can be by itself. The dewdrop is not a solo act. It is air, vapor, gravity, night, morning, and time itself. You are not a separate entity. You are your ancestors, your memories, your breath, your wounds, your triumphs. You are the books you've read, the kindness you've received, the dreams you've let go. The idea that anything is independent is just that, an idea. But reality doesn't work that way. There's a beautiful Buddhist teaching that says, to understand one thing deeply is to understand everything. It's not philosophy, it's observation. If you look deeply into your sadness, you'll find your past. If you look deeply into your past, you'll find other people's pain. And if you keep looking, you'll see how the sorrow of one heart is stitched into the sorrow of all beings. Because nothing exists alone. Think of a spider web in the early morning glistening with dew. Pull on one thread and the whole web shivers. That's the nature of existence. Pull on one life and the universe feels it. When a forest is cut down in one part of the world, people suffer in cities far away. When one person acts with cruelty, it ripples through generations. But the same is true with kindness, with compassion, with presence. You matter, not as a separate self, but as a vital note in the grand symphony of being. So often we feel small, insignificant, like a grain of sand in a vast desert. But in the light of dependent origination, that view dissolves. Because that grain of sand could not exist without the entire desert. and the desert is not complete without it. You are not a meaningless speck. You are the meeting point of endless causes and conditions. You are a reflection of all things, and all things reflect in you. And when this realization sinks in, not just in the mind, but in the marrow, something begins to shift. You stop blaming yourself for everything, because you see, your pain didn't arise alone. It came from a web of inherited burdens, unmet needs, conditions you didn't choose. But you also stop blaming others, because you realize they too are caught in the web. They too are acting from causes and effects they didn't ask for. This is not resignation. This is the birth of compassion. To see that nothing exists alone is to realize that we are all responsible, not in a heavy, burdensome way, but in a tender, shared way. Because if nothing exists alone, then no act of kindness is small, no moment of awareness is wasted, no life is irrelevant, the ripple is real, and it starts with you. In the vast web of life, the dewdrop is not isolated. It's held by a leaf, fed by mist, born from air, destined to rejoin the clouds. And so are we. So the next time you feel disconnected, stop, take a breath, look around, and remember you're already part of everything. And everything is already within you. What is a moment? We say it all the time, just a moment. That moment changed everything. I missed the moment. But do we ever stop to feel what a moment truly is? Is it a second, a breath, a glance? Is it measurable or is it immeasurable? In Buddhism, a moment isn't just a passing tick of time. It's a gateway, a threshold, a crack in the illusion of permanence where the entire universe peeks through. There is a saying from the Zen tradition, in a single moment of clear awareness, 1,000 lifetimes are revealed. This is not exaggeration. This is reality. Because when you become fully present, truly, utterly here, something extraordinary happens. The past, the future, even the boundary of the self all dissolve. And in their place is the one thing we so often miss. Now. Not the now of the clock, but the eternal now, the still point where everything converges. Think about it. When you're truly present, whether listening to a friend, watching the rain, or tasting a piece of fruit, you're not just touching that experience. You're touching life itself. You're touching everything that led to this moment. And you're touching everything that will grow from it. In one heartbeat, the past and future are held together like water in a single drop. That is the miracle of a moment, but we rarely see it. Why? Because our minds are always elsewhere, tangled in memories, tangled in worries, tangled in wanting something else. We move through life like someone scrolling endlessly through a feed, hungry but never satisfied, alive but never awake. And all the while, life is happening. The sacred is whispering, but we're too distracted to hear. What if you stopped, right now? What if you let your shoulders drop, your breath slow, your awareness soften, and instead of looking for something, you just looked? No judgment, no story, just the raw presence of this moment. As it is, try it, just for a few seconds. Feel your body. Listen to the quiet sounds around you. Notice the space between your thoughts. You're not doing anything special. And yet, in this simple act of being, you're touching infinity. There's a famous koan in Zen Buddhism. A student asked, "What is Buddha?" The master replied, 3 pounds of flax. Strange, right? But that's the point. The sacred is not separate. It doesn't live only in scriptures or statues or monasteries. It lives in the ordinary when you see it as it truly is. That piece of cloth, that cup on your table, that flicker in someone's eye. Every moment holds the entire truth, if and only if you're willing to be here for it. The Avatamsaka Sutra, one of the most profound texts in Mahayana Buddhism, says, "A single instant of thought contains the 3 times, past, present, and future." What does that mean? It means that in a flash of true awareness, You are not bound by linear time. You are standing at the center of all things, where the river of cause and effect meets the ocean of being. Every experience you've ever had, every choice, every tear, every breath, is flowing through this moment. And if you can meet it without grasping, without pushing, without fear, you will see you've never been apart from life at all. But here's the paradox. Moments are fleeting. They vanish the instant we try to hold them. So how do we touch them? How do we live inside the now without trying to trap it? The answer is simple. Don't try to possess it. Just meet it, like greeting a guest who never stays, like watching a firefly disappear into the night. You don't need to own the moment. You just need to be there when it arrives. And when you are, even just once, you'll understand what all the sages were trying to tell us, that the universe is not something out there. It's right here, breathing with you, blinking with you, being you. There's a Zen phrase: spring comes and the grass grows by itself. It doesn't need your effort. It doesn't ask your permission. It simply happens when the conditions are right. And the same is true for awakening. You don't need to force it. You don't need to chase it. You just need to show up, fully, softly, now. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, lost in thought, pulled in 1,000 directions, come back to one thing, one breath, one sound, one glance, one dewdrop. And see not just with your eyes, but with your whole being. Because if you see deeply enough, you'll realize this moment is not just a moment, it's everything. What if everything you thought you were was just a story, not a lie, but a fragile arrangement of thoughts, memories, labels, and fears, held together by habit, believed in so deeply that we call it me. In Buddhism, this is where the path turns inward sharply, because if we truly want to understand the nature of the dewdrop, we must first understand the nature of the self. And here we meet one of the most misunderstood yet liberating teachings in all of Buddhism, sunyata, emptiness. But emptiness doesn't mean nothingness. It doesn't mean hollow, void, or meaningless. In fact, it means the opposite. It means fullness without clinging, existence without fixation, form without imprisonment. It means that nothing exists independently, not even you. Think of a wave in the ocean. It rises, dances in the sunlight, glides across the surface, beautiful, unique. And then it disappears. Did the wave die? No. It simply returned to where it had always belonged, to the vastness it had never left. This is the truth of yourself. You are not a static, solid identity. You are a process constantly shifting, forming, dissolving. Thoughts come and go. Feelings rise and fall. Names change, faces age, stories evolve. What remains? Nothing that you can grasp, and yet everything that is. The Buddha taught that what we call the self is made up of 5 skandhas, 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Like a flame from 5 burning sticks, you are just a temporary convergence. There is no solid I behind the curtain, only movement, only unfolding. This is not a philosophical game. It is the key to freedom. Because when we let go of the illusion of a fixed self, we stop clinging, we stop comparing, we stop defending, we stop fearing death because we realize there was never a separate self to begin with. Let's pause here. This teaching can feel disorienting at first, even frightening. We've been taught all our lives to build a strong identity, to stand out, to be someone, to protect what is mine. But what if freedom doesn't come from strengthening the self, but from seeing through it, like mist in the morning sun? The harder you try to hold it, the faster it slips away. But if you stop grasping, you begin to see the landscape beyond, and suddenly everything is open. There's a Zen story. A monk asked, "What is my true self?" The master replied, "Who is asking?" Silence, that's the answer. Because every time you point to yourself, you're pointing at something changing. Your body, It was different 5 years ago. Your mind, it shifts every moment. Your beliefs, your moods, your dreams, they flicker, pass, return, dissolve. So what's left? Awareness, not your awareness, not a personal watcher, but awareness itself, boundaryless, centerless, pure. The mirror before the image, the silence before the sound, that is the essence, that is the ocean. And the wave called you has always been part of it. Now imagine this. If there is no solid self inside you, there's also no solid other outside you. All walls are imagined, all divisions drawn in the sand by a restless mind. What happens when the separation dissolves? You no longer act from ego, but from spaciousness. You love without possession. You grieve without despair. You live without fear of losing who you are. Because you see, you were never lost. This is not an abstract state only for monks or mystics. You've touched it already more than you realize. Have you ever been so immersed in a sunset, a song, or a moment of awe that you forgot yourself? No identity, no narrative, just presence. That's it. That's emptiness lived. It's not about vanishing. It's about being fully here without the tightness of me and mine. In that looseness there is peace, and in that peace there is power. The wisdom of emptiness is not cold. It is not detachment. It is the warmest thing in the world, because it dissolves every boundary that keeps us apart. When there is no separate I, then your joy is mine, your suffering is mine. Compassion flows naturally, not as a duty, but as the only response that makes sense. Because when there is no boundary, how could I hurt you without hurting myself? The dewdrop too is empty, not meaningless, not non-existent, but free. It doesn't cling to being a drop. It doesn't resist the sun when it turns to mist. It doesn't fear returning to the sea. It knows in its silence that it has always been water, and so have we. Take a breath, not because you have to, but because you notice it. Inhale, pause, exhale. That's it. You just touched the present moment. You just met the universe without going anywhere. In Buddhism, the breath is not just a biological function. It is a sacred portal, a teacher, a thread that ties body, mind, and spirit into one seamless now. Each breath, fleeting, quiet, unnoticed, is a mirror that reflects the entire nature of existence. Why? Because in the breath we see impermanence, we see interdependence, we see emptiness and yet aliveness. Let's look closer. A breath arises. Where did it come from? You didn't make it. You didn't invent air. You didn't command the lungs to move. Breathing just happens. It is life living through you. And when you let go of control, when you simply observe, you begin to feel a truth deeper than thought. You are not breathing. Breathing is breathing, and you are that. One breath fully seen contains the whole cosmos. Why? Because it's not your breath, it's shared. It belongs to the wind, the trees, the oceans, the atmosphere. The air you inhale may have been part of a pine forest, a mountain peak, or someone's last sigh across the world. There is no boundary, just circulation, just exchange, just the endless dance of give and take, rise and fall, birth and death, all contained in this one. Simple breath. The Buddha taught anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, not as a relaxation technique, but as a path to awakening. Because when you truly observe the breath without clinging, without judgment, you begin to dissolve, not disappear but dissolve, into something larger than the story of you. You become space, awareness, presence. You start to feel what ancient teachers meant when they said, in one breath, the 10,000 dharmas unfold. There is a Zen saying, when you breathe in, it is the universe entering. When you breathe out, it is the universe being released. Not metaphorically. Literally, each breath is a ceremony, a sacred movement, a silent chant that says, I am here, I am part, I am nothing, I am all. Let's go deeper. What happens if you follow the breath, not just for a few seconds, but like a monk for hours, days, years? What happens when the breath becomes your anchor, your prayer, your home? Something remarkable. The separation between observer and observed begins to blur. There is no longer me watching the breath. There is only breathing, a seamless flow, a non-dual awareness. The illusion of self begins to soften until what remains is just presence. And in that presence, a strange thing happens. Time slows down, the noise quiets, fear thins out. Because breath, real conscious breath, only exists in the now. And the now is the only place suffering dissolves. No one suffers in a breath. Pain lives in the past. Anxiety lives in the future. But the breath, it lives in eternity. Let's try something together. Right now, just sit. Let your spine rise. Let your shoulders drop. And feel the breath breathing you. Don't force it, don't fix it. Just witness it like watching clouds move across a still sky. Inhale. Exhale, there it is, the entire universe, inside your chest. Soft pause, ambient background, breath-like sounds fade in. This is not just meditation. It's not a ritual. It's a reunion with what you already are. Because the breath has been here since the moment you were born, and it will be there at the final bow. The breath is the first gift, and the last whisper, and in between, it is the song of life, if only we listen. So when the world overwhelms you, when thoughts spin like stormy winds, when the self feels heavy, and the future uncertain, come back to the breath, to the now, to the infinite hiding in plain sight. Because to see one breath fully is to see the truth of everything. There's a Zen saying, to see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wildflower. But this is more than poetry. This is a doorway, a Dharma gate, a truth the Buddha saw not with the eyes but with awakened mind. And nowhere is this truth sung more profoundly than in the Avatamsaka Sutra, the flower garland scripture. Imagine a universe where every single thing, every leaf, every thought, every atom contains the entirety of all other things. A world where the whole cosmos is reflected in a single dewdrop, and each dewdrop reflects all other dewdrops, endlessly, holographically, without limit. This is not science fiction. This is the vision of interpenetration, of boundless interconnectedness, of the Indra's net, a jewel-studded net that stretches infinitely across space and time. At every crossing point, a jewel, and in every jewel, the reflection of all other jewels. And in those reflections, the reflections of reflections, infinitely nested, infinitely whole. This is not metaphor. This is reality, seen with awakened eyes. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Buddha reveals that no single event, being, or object exists in isolation. Nothing arises by itself. Nothing exists for itself, and therefore everything is sacred. A flower is not just a flower. It is earth, rain, sunlight, time, space, and you. It is also the song of bees, the hand of the gardener, the eye that beholds it, and the soil that once held your ancestors. Let's pause here. Take a flower, any flower, hold it in your palm, really see it, not as a thing, not as an object, but as an event, a miracle, a gathering of the whole cosmos in fragile, fragrant form. Look closer. Inside it you'll find the clouds that brought the rain, the sun that gave its warmth, the worm that fertilized the earth, the breeze that scattered its seed, and the mind that now beholds it. This is totality inside form, infinity within the temporary, the unconditioned dancing through the conditioned. In the Avatamsaka, there is no separation between form and emptiness, no battle between self and other, only the radiant tapestry of Dharmadhatu, the realm of suchness. And in that vision, the boundaries dissolve. A monk bows to a flower and sees countless Buddhas bowing back. A drop of morning dew becomes a universe of wisdom. A footprint in the mud becomes a gateway to eternity. This is not delusion. This is true seeing. There is a story of the great Bodhisattva Samantabhadra, who made infinite vows to liberate all beings. When asked how he would do this, how he could possibly reach all beings in all worlds, he smiled and he said, "In one atom I see 10 million worlds. In each moment I serve all beings." This is the power of Avatamsaka wisdom. It does not rely on scale. It relies on depth. Because in true reality there is no near or far, no big or small, just endless presence intimately interwoven. So what does this mean for you? It means you are not a separate entity walking through a dead world. You are a living node of reality itself. And every thought, word, and action echoes across the entire web of existence. When you speak with kindness, the whole universe shifts. When you breathe mindfully, the galaxies respond. When you see clearly, the flower blooms inside you. The Avatamsaka Sutra doesn't ask us to abandon the world. It asks us to see it rightly, not as a place of separate objects, but as a great symphony of mutual arising, where there is no center, no edge, no beginning, no end, only endless unfolding, only the dance of suchness. And that dance is happening now, in your body, in your breath, in your heart, right here in this moment of listening. You are part of it, you are it, a flower, just a flower, and yet all things are present in it. This is not mysticism. This is Dharma. To see the universe in a flower is to know there is no I separate from the world. There is only the world seeing itself through I. The ocean is vast, but it is made of tiny drops, and life is made of moments. So often we yearn for spiritual realization, cosmic insight, awakening like a thunderclap. But the Buddha reminds us, the way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart. And the heart lives here. In this moment, right now, imagine this. You're washing a bowl, nothing special, just soap, water, porcelain, but then you notice the warmth of the water on your hands. You feel the texture of the bowl. You hear the tiny splash as you move. In that simple act, you are nowhere else. You are here fully, and in that presence, you've touched the ocean. Mindfulness is not an escape. It is a return to reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. When we're mindful, we don't shrink the world, we magnify it. We don't withdraw from life, we enter it more deeply. Just like a single drop of water holds the reflection of the entire sky, one mindful breath can hold the entire universe. Think of the ocean. It doesn't rush, it doesn't strive. It simply receives every wave, every wind, every sky. When we practice mindfulness, we become like the ocean, still, yet vast, deep, yet open. We let the world reflect in us, but we are not disturbed by its waves. This is not passivity. It is power, the power of non-reactivity, of clarity, of peace. So how do we live this in ordinary life? Let me tell you a story. There was once a laywoman named Vimala who asked a monk, "I work in the marketplace. I cook, I clean, I tend to my children. Can I still touch the Dharma?" The monk replied, "When stirring the pot, be with the pot. When walking to the well, be with each step. When looking into your child's eyes, see the Buddha." Vimala wept, not because it was hard, but because it was so simple and so beautiful. Mindfulness is not limited to the meditation cushion. It belongs in the way we tie our shoes, the way we speak to a stranger, the way we listen without interrupting, the way we sip tea without distraction. Each act, no matter how small, becomes a mirror, and in that mirror we see ourselves, the world, the Dharma. Here's the miracle: you don't have to change your life. You only have to show up for it, fully, lovingly, without rushing past. When brushing your teeth, don't scroll your phone. When walking, don't run in your mind. Because this moment, just this one, is a dewdrop and in it, the whole ocean. But let's be honest, the world is noisy, our minds are busy. Mindfulness doesn't mean we're always calm. It means we remember to come back again and again. It means when we forget, we smile and return gently like the tide returning to shore. You don't need to see cosmic light. You only need to see clearly a cup, a breath, a footstep, a silence. Each of these, when touched with awareness, becomes sacred ground. So ask yourself right now, are you in this moment, or are you watching it from afar? What do you hear? What do you feel? What is here before words? Just this. And in just this, the vast ocean of being, there is a moment, quiet and wordless, when you look into the eyes of another being, and something shifts. The boundary between you and them dissolves. You don't feel compassion, you become it. In Buddhist thought, compassion is not a moral duty. It's not something we should do to be good people. It is what naturally arises when we truly see things as they are. When we see interbeing, that all things arise together. That your joy is my joy. Your pain is my pain. Then hurting you would be hurting myself. The great teacher Thich Nh letter 1ea5t, H letter 1ea1nh once said, "We are not separate, we interare." Like the ocean and its waves, you may call one Lisa and another Tom, but they are made of the same water, the same breath that fills your lungs. Pass through the trees, the stars, the mouths of ancient beings. Where does you end and me begin? Let me tell you a story. In ancient India, there was a monk who sat in deep meditation. Every day, a little bird came and perched on his knee. One day, a child threw a rock and injured the bird. The monk looked at the bleeding wing, and tears fell from his eyes. He whispered, "The bird is me, the boy is me. The pain is mine, all of it." He didn't judge the child. He didn't hate the world. He only saw more deeply. And that is the seed of compassion. Why do we hurt others? Because we believe they are other. We say, he deserves it. She's wrong. They are not like me. This illusion of separateness. This is the root of violence. But when you see the truth of oneness, cruelty becomes impossible. Even indifference becomes unbearable. Compassion is not weakness. It's not softness. It is the courage to feel everything, to open the heart so wide that even the sorrow of the world can pass through it, not to drown you, but to cleanse you. Have you ever comforted a crying child? You didn't need philosophy. You didn't need religion. You simply saw their pain, and your heart moved. This is compassion in its purest form, a reflex of oneness. In the Zen tradition, there's a saying, enlightenment is intimacy with all things. That intimacy with sorrow, with joy, with the ant crawling on your windowsill, is not an abstract idea. It is lived, felt, embodied, and from it flows a natural reverence you cannot harm, because you cannot unsee the truth. When you harm the earth, you feel it in your lungs. When you speak with anger, you hear the echo in your own mind. When you withhold love, you feel the cold inside your own chest. Because you are not just a person in the world. You are the world appearing as a person. So how do we live this compassion? Not through grand gestures, not through performance, but through presence. Listening without waiting to speak. Touching gently, speaking slowly. Feeding a stray animal, smiling with the eyes. These are not small things. They are the sacred acts of the awakened heart. And yes, you will feel vulnerable. Yes, the world will sometimes break your heart. But it is better to have a heart that breaks than one that has hardened, because only an open heart can heal. We began this journey with a dewdrop. Now we begin to see. Every dewdrop reflects not only the sky, but the heart of all beings. And when you see the world in one drop, you hold the power to transform the whole ocean with a word, with a look, with a single act of compassion. Close your eyes, take one breath, not to change anything, not to achieve anything, just to see. See what? Everything, and nothing at all. Awareness is not something you do. It is what remains when you stop doing. It is not an object you can grasp. It is the mirror in which all things appear. When you sit quietly, without chasing, without resisting, what remains is not emptiness, but pure seeing, seeing without separation, seeing without labels. In Buddhist meditation, this is called vipassana, insight, not into facts or theories, but into reality as it is. When you observe the rising of a thought and do not follow it, when you feel a sensation in the body and do not judge it, when you witness anger, sadness, joy, and simply allow it to be, then you are no longer inside the illusion. You are looking through it. A Zen master once asked his student, without thinking good or bad, what is your original face? What is your true nature before you were named? Before you were taught to divide the world into this and that, self and other, subject and object. When the mirror is clean, there is no self and no other reflected, just what is. We are taught to believe that awareness comes from the brain, as if it were a flashlight shining out. But the Buddhist view is different. Awareness is like the sky, open, boundless, ever-present. Thoughts are like clouds, appearing and disappearing within it. You are not the clouds. You are not even the sky. You are the capacity to reflect all things. Imagine holding a mirror. You lift it toward a rose, the rose appears. You lift it toward a corpse, the corpse appears. The mirror does not cling, does not recoil, does not prefer one over the other. It simply reflects. This is the mind of a Buddha. Why is this important? Because in ordinary life, we are identified with everything that passes. A thought arises, I am not good enough. And we believe it. A fear arises, they might leave me. And we panic. A desire arises, I must have this. And we chase, but the mirror doesn't run. The mirror doesn't cling. The mirror knows that what appears will pass. And so peace. To see without separation is not to deny difference. It is to see that beneath difference, there is one field of awareness. When you stop grasping, everything is already here. When you stop naming, everything speaks its own name. Let's go deeper. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Buddha describes Indra's net, an infinite web stretching across the universe. At every intersection, a jewel. Each jewel reflects all the others. Endlessly, you are one jewel, so am I. So is the ant, the wind, the birth of a star. When one moves, all shimmer. This is not poetry. This is how things are. You are not just a reflection in the net. You are the net itself. Awareness is not separate from the world. It is the world, seen clearly. This is why a Zen master may look at a tree and burst into tears, not because it is beautiful, but because in that moment, there is no tree, no observer, no boundary at all, just suchness, just this. So how do we practice this? Not by escaping life, but by entering it fully, mindfully, with the mirror of awareness turned inward and outward, washing the dishes as if washing the moon, walking as if kissing the earth, listening as if your soul depends on it, breathing as if every breath is the first and the last. This is not about becoming calm. This is about becoming clear. When awareness is steady, the self becomes transparent, and what shines through is not you at all. It is the universe, awake to itself. As we near the final chapter, let this be your question. If I no longer see through the eyes of separation, if I no longer act from self-protection, what kind of world opens up? What kind of love? What kind of freedom? You have journeyed with us, from a single dewdrop to the vast ocean. But this journey was never outward. It has always been a return to what was already here. To see one dewdrop is to know the ocean, not because the drop contains the ocean, but because it is never separate from it. The Buddha didn't teach in order to give us beliefs. He taught so we could see. He pointed to a flower, and Mahakasyapa smiled. He raised his hand in silence, and the whole Dharma was transmitted. Why? Because truth is not in words. It is in seeing directly, seeing this moment, hearing this breath, touching this life, in its raw, unfiltered, unguarded wholeness. We began with a single question: can one small thing, one moment, one breath, one thought, reveal the infinite? Now you know the answer, not because I told you, but because you felt it. When the mind quiets, even for a second, a great gate opens, not to another world, but to this one as it truly is, unfiltered by ego, uncolored by fear, unbroken by illusion. You stand at the shoreless ocean, and suddenly you remember you've always been water. So what now? Do we return to our noisy lives, to the rush, the roles, the forgetting? Yes, but with new eyes. Eyes that see the web of life in every interaction. Ears that hear the silence behind every sound. Hands that touch with compassion. Because they no longer feel separate, the real teaching begins. Not in the temple, but in the grocery line, the traffic jam, the hurtful comment, the aching body. They're right there. You can pause, breathe, see, and remember, this too is the ocean. To live the teaching is to walk this world, not as someone special, but as someone present. You don't need robes, you don't need a cave. You only need sincerity and silence and the courage to return again and again to this breath, this moment, this drop. Let your life be the mirror. Let your presence be the teaching. Let your kindness ripple outward, from one drop to all beings, to the ocean without end. And when doubt returns, as it surely will, don't fight it, just smile, like Mahakasyapa smiled, like the Buddha smiled, like the flower blooming in silence. One dewdrop, infinite reflection. One breath, endless depth. You are not apart from the ocean, you are it. Now go, live like the ocean remembers itself. In every drop that falls,